Good evening, good evening, good evening. I'm going to wander for a little bit if that's okay. I hate standing still. My name, for you who I don't know, and most of you I don't know, I'm Christopher Madison. I'm the director of the Soma project at City U. Would you pass some of those out, please? And one of the co-founders with my co-conspirator sitting there in the glasses, Tom Elo, of the Hong Kong Atlas series, which is, and this evening to some extent is, about centimeters on the shelf. Most of you know the rendition series at Chinese U, which has arguably been probably one of the greatest supporters of Hong Kong literature and English translation over the past few decades. But they are not exclusively or even primarily a publisher of Hong Kong literature and translation. It is a strong aspect of their line. So, if you are slightly neurotic, you will find all the books that they've published within the last 20 years, and if you squeeze them gently on a shelf, you will see that they equal about 12 centimeters of spine over those 20 years, which is far more than anyone else has even pretended to publish. What we are attempting to do, or we're in the midst of doing now with the Hong Kong Atlas series, and the book we're celebrating tonight, Dorothy Says Snow and Shadow, is the first official, tangible result of that, is to do 20 inches in 3 years. Through a combination. That's Paul Kamek, head of Asian and International Studies at City U. This is going to be a combination of prose, of poetry, and one graphic collection of adaptations of the work. But we'll stop about the series, and we'll talk very briefly about Dorothy, but mostly I want her to be able to read this evening, because many of you already know her work, or if you don't, I'd like you to get to know her work through her voice. I will speak briefly from what Nikki Harman, her translator, had to say about her work, because a translator should have the first and the last word, if a translator. Should I go to here for now? Here's the important part. Dorothy Tse describes the inhabitants of Hong Kong as hovering among languages. And this is key here, because Hong Kong is a place that remains liminal rather than hybrid, palimpsestuous rather than a melting pot. There's a lot of disses could be used to characterize Dorothy's work. Dismemberment, displacement, dislocation, disuse. In her stories, she has the power and the careful weight of a Chekhov, where something wouldn't have to happen in the stories for you to be intrigued, but it always does. There's a twist. It's not so much, I think, surreal, which many of Dorothy and her colleagues get sort of pasted with that moniker, as much as it is sort of shifting perceptions of light and weight. So back to what the translator was saying. Hovering among languages, Cantonese, Mandarin, other Chinese dialects. Actually, Dorothy didn't say that, the translator did. She did say, though, that for Hong Kong writers, written Chinese is a language of distance and requires meditation. Contrary to the mainland literature that tried to borrow languages from the working class as well as the farmers in the 50s as a way to reach the public, Hong Kong's literature has a tradition of resistance to the language of daily life. its highly experimental language is a strategy to distinguish a literary work from an entertaining and commercial one. In Hong Kong, writing itself is an active rejection of utilitarian society and mundane every life. I would like to thank the Fringe Club for these lovely environs, Frank Proctor and Muse for all the work they did on this book, and to the Hong Kong Arts Development Council, which is funding this series of 10 books over 3 years and are allowing us, enabling us to actually pay authors a fair wage, to pay translators a fair wage, to pay editors, to pay designers, to make a difference on the shelf. But now you get to hear from Dorothy.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks, Chris, for introducing me and the project. I would like to thank everyone who is involved in the project to make this happen. I'm looking forward to see other books being published. Thank you, Frank, very much for making this event happening. All of the story in this book are originally written in Chinese. When I say Chinese, we speak Cantonese, but I think most of the writers, we write in written Chinese, so we can all understand each other. So that's why I say it's a distant language from our daily life. So thank you very much to Nikki Harmon, who translated my work. It's a wonderful translation. I'm too bad she can't be here tonight. And also I have to thank Frank again and James for their editing and also helpful suggestion during the whole translation process. So tonight I'm going to read a few stories from the book. The first story I want to read is the most recent one. The story originally was published in an English newspaper. In a series of, in the film of Water. So this story called Woman Fish appeared first in its English translation. Here I'm going to read the excerpts from the story. He knows his wife will never be able to tell lies again. One morning, he realized that his wife's sleek, pale head was completely without hair. Her mouth was huge, protruding like a ship cleaving the still waters of the sea. Her eyes had slipped to the side of her face. Her breasts were two melting glaciers, slowly sinking into her body. When she walked naked towards him, all that was left of the woman were her smooth, muscular legs. Apart from that, she had transformed completely into a fish. Some sounds are lost forever. He will never hear his wife tapping at the computer again. She never sits on the sofa, looking down at her fingernails as she slowly paints on layer after layer of scallop varnish, looking up to tell him some invented story about a helicopter or a cat. Now his wife's rounded shadow rarely slants across the window pane. Outside the city, it's gradually getting colder. Her ice-cold hands have shrunk to little things that it seems will never again touch things on dry land. Sometimes she soaks herself in the bathtub, lying back to reveal her pasty fish's belly. He sees long, slender legs stretching out from her belly, muscles running up her thighs towards spiral genitalia. Sometimes they make love. His wife's huge mouth opens and shuts, sending out bubbles with a fishy smell that fills the room. He shuts his eyes. He can no longer distinguish ecstasy from anguish, in his wife's shrill gasps. He imagines waking from a nightmare to find his wife has gone out through the unlocked door alone, losing herself in the city's lawless back streets, ending up auctioned off in an underground seafood restaurant. Or maybe she will be spotted by pimps and installed as a diversion in a brothel. He sees his wife flattened out, studded with glinting light bulbs on an enormous poster. But one bulb has broken, and the filament sticks in his head, the scene before him gradually fading into darkness. His wife has stopped eating. He fills a huge fish tank for her and sets it up in the middle of the sitting room. When she puts her head into it, he hears a gurgling sound and a stream of bubbles rises to the surface. But most of the time, she sits motionless on a chair in front of the picture of a river that hangs on the wall. In her eyes, a torrent of ambiguous color surges past, gradually narrowing until it vanished into transparency. All night long, he can hear the waters pulling back. He tries making another map of the city in his head and tracing the course of the river. Driving around the outskirts, they can't find where it starts. A river flows in blue planked on the wooden hoarding that enclose the city's waterways. Behind the board, he can hear machines dumping silt. Their car shoots across a collapsing bridge. Distant factory chimney belch thick smoke like fiery inverted rockets. The ground splits and cracks into fissures as enigmatic as oracle bones. His lungs swell silently until they almost burst. He does not know if they have arrived at the river, but he can smell an appalling stench. The humidity keeps rising, and his wife, overcome with excitement, beats her body against the car door, making a snapping sound on the glass. So this is the first story. The next story I would like to read first appeared in my handmade chapbook called Monthly Matters, Yusi in Cantonese. Yusi has a double meaning in Chinese, which can mean things happen every month and also a woman's menstrual cycle. The chapbook contains 30 linked stories, one for each month, from January to January. The characters of the stories are fixed. They include the narrator I, his younger sister, Mui Mui in Cantonese, and also their father. But each story can be read individually. Most of the story were inspired by current events in Hong Kong around 2008 and 2009. I use Monthly Matters as the title because, to me, the city might seem progressing to many people, but in fact, I think it's more like a woman's spirit. The city's history is more like a cycle. I don't know the following story would make you think of the mainland woman who come to Hong Kong to give birth. And also the conflict between the mainlanders and Hong Kong people nowadays. But at the time when I was writing the story, the conflict between Hong Kong and mainland is not as tense. And also, it was the Hong Kong young mothers who abandoned their babies that inspired me more to write this story. So I'm going to read the whole story. Monthly Matters, April, pregnancy. In April, there is another rush of pregnant women into the city. At this point, we are still living with the wolf. A wolf draped in woman's overcoat had slunk into the city by night. When the pregnant women rush into other people's house, the wolf rushes into ours. They occupy our biggest rooms, and they've eaten up all the pickled vegetables we have been storing for years, say the neighbors. It is hard to tell the difference between the wolf and the woman, but when the neighbors complain, we cannot help gloating. The most the wolf will do is prowl around the apartment, licking up the dust particles in the air. The pregnant women vomit noisily all day, but the wolf sneaks silently into our bathroom. There it coils up in the dark, damp corner under the sink and shuts its eyes. Every day we strip in front of the wolf and show our nakedness. The wolf opens its eyes and fixes us with a measuring stare. I do not remember when the wolf finally agrees to share a bed with Mui Mui and sit at the dinner table with us. By now, the city hospitals are packed with big-bellied pregnant women. Once they have aborted their fetuses, they will go back home. Only the wolf remains, awaiting the birth of its infant, its departure day uncertain. We secretly bring the fetus discarded behind the hospital back home and feed them bowlful by bowlful to the wolf. But the wolf is little, and sometimes in the middle of dinner start to pace back and forth in front of the window. We know that it is staring out at the hospital building. If we don't kill the next generation, our own generation may become distinct. I try to explain this to the wolf, but it looks at me uncomprehendingly. It seems to find the city more and more intolerable. However, as a mother, it has tacitly consented to give birth in the hospital. We take the wolf to the hospital early one morning. Finally, its belly has begun to swell. As we watch, the doctor slits the wolf's belly open and takes out a bloody lump of matter. As we expect, it is not the wolf's infant. It is Mui Mui, sound asleep. The wolf's belly is very warm, Mui Mui tells us. She has never had such a sound sleep. It is the right place to nurture an infant. But the wolf isn't pregnant, said the doctor. Maybe the wolves that could have impregnated it have gone distinct. There is still a constant stream of pregnant women arriving in town. But I know that the last wolf has died in our hospital, even though for a while Mui Mui insists she is the wolf's progeny. So, there are more stories. I'm going to read the next one in Cantonese, but it's a very short paragraph. Last year, I published a co-author book called A Dictionary of Two Cities, 雙城詞典, with my friend Han Naiju. She's also in this project. I think her book is coming out next year. And this book is written in the form of dictionary. For each story, my friend and I would pick the same Chinese character and try to interpret it in our own way, starting with a made-up phrase in Cantonese and use the character. Most of the story begin with a definition of the phrase, like in the dictionary. The foreign story is based on the word mute, and I'm using the invented phrase mute door, mun. So here is the excerpts. 門的建造只是為了掩飾門並不存在的事實。 恰恰因為進入與離開都了無痕跡，暗示才成為了必須的儀式。所有的門因此都是象徵性的，剩下來只有麻木的愉悅本身，無邊無際，無可防備，無可決定。無論置身被殖民者語言佔領的街道，或是紅色的6月廣場，默劇表演者總是能夠默默地創造屬於他們自身的房子。只要一雙手，一種貼着牆壁行走的姿態，一面圍牆瞬間浮現、消失，緊隨着默劇表演者猝不及防的腳步以及旋轉的角度。那樣的房子並不需要深深的挖地，也不必把根基建在磐石上。它的材料是身體的詩意，骨與肉神秘運行的軌道。房子沒有邊界，卻也沒有進入的縫隙。觀眾會突然洞察，門不過是一尾永遠無法捉住的魚，一再從掌心流走。而默劇表演者的名言之一卻是：門並非外在的東西。So now I'm going to read the last story. This story is from my first collection of stories called So Black, 好黑. The title is a Cantonese phrase. That's something you would say when you are in really bad luck. Like, for example, if you want to say today, I'm really bad luck, you would say that 今日我真係好黑啊. So the title also comes from the foreign story I'm going to read, called Blasted Bodies. After a male character trades his eyesight for a prostitute, he looks up the sun and says, "It's so black." Here are some excerpts from the story. Wyland has no marriage system, but was famous for its prosperous sex industry. Even bartering was allowed. When the male clients cannot afford to pay, they could obtain sexual services by trading their body parts. In October, the girl and her brother arrived in Wyland by boat. The streets were full of people selling creamlets. They ladled out golden butter onto sizzling hot plates, where it spread out and set in perfect dish that seems to hint at a breasted life. "You will lose your body here," said her brother as he brought her a creamlet. The cream oozed out over the thin, grease-proof paper and onto her brother's hand, like happiness brimming over. But the fragrant smell of the creamlet just made the girl want to vomit. In November, the girl placed her feet side by side, joining her big toes together. It was cold as the yellow glass on the opposite side of the street. Behind the glass, she could see the face of a young man, tilted slightly upwards. The young man's gaze was climbing right into her window. The face appeared so often that she came to regard it as part of the street scene. The young man came over to the girl. He was dressed in a baggy black sweater, and his hair was chopped short. The girl had not realized until then just how pallid he was, almost like someone in a black and white photo. He tore down one of her leaflets, and a single patch of wet appeared on each pale cheek. It was, for the girl, as rich a color as the blooded plastic bags that she had seen in the street. The mother, seeing her one-armed son standing in the doorway, was not surprised. It was as she had foreseen. The night sky was not very dark. There was a row of 4 street lamps, but only one of them emitted a flickering light, and her son stood under it in his black sweater. His empty left sleeve dangled limply, showing that now he was a man, and he had grown tall and slender, and looked as desolate as an empty roll. His amputation did not worry his mother. All the men in Wyland learned to do everything one-handed from boyhood, even buttoning their coats with both feet, as well as all sorts of other minor tasks. What did worry her was the way he lay in bed, biting his fingernails and smiling a little smile. He just looked too blessed. It seemed that he didn't regret the loss of an arm at all. Silently, in a funereal mood, his mother got his dinner ready. Her son carried on lying on the bed, his head to one side, his eyes shut day after day in the same position. His mother was mostly puzzled by this, although sometimes the scene filled her with an almost religious fervor. Hot of ants began to gather at his bedside, as if on a pilgrimage. His mother took a broom, and as she swept, heaps of Coca-Cola cans scattered out from under the bed. She remembered how years before he used to lie in bed, obsessed by books on witchcraft. He ate nothing as he read. He just drank Coke. He kept this up for 4 years. After his mother washed the old Coke cans, she covered the walls of the house with them and used them to erect a fence outside the house too. The dazzling red of the cans filled her with a near certainty that he would risk his life for his obsession. Once, when she was sure her son was asleep, she allocated 10 cans in the Coke wall that she had marked and stuffed with $20 bills, and skillfully extracted them. After she checked to make sure that none of the money was missing, she hesitated for a long time, thinking about whether to use the money to fulfill her son's desires, but finally decided against it. Before putting the cans back in place, she took a roll of bills from one of them and put it under the 7th floorboard from the door, the one right next to the wall. The money would be enough to give her son a decent funeral, she thought to herself.
This is the, oh, am I on? No. This is the interactive part of the evening, so anyone with questions, and Dorothy has asked that one of you ask questions and not me, so that they're not complex and spoken too quickly. But I'm going to ask one anyway. All right, we end with bodies. Transformation of, and throughout your works, many characters choose to give away limbs or to transform themselves into some other figure or lose themselves coming around a street corner they thought they'd known for 30 years. How do these link together overall in the collection?
Oh, you mean how the bodies?
The bodies, yeah.
I think I have interest in body, but I think I write them in for different reasons. For example, the woman fish story, as I have said, it was for a theme of water. And in fact, that story was inspired by some photographs taken by a photographer called Lou Guang. He takes some pictures of mainland China about pollution, and you can see the bodies changes because of the pollution. So for me, like when you say transformation, I think there's something happening to us nowadays. It's not in fiction. So for me, transformation is kind of reality.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned the collaborative work that you published with Honlai-Chu.
Yeah.
And you've worked in the past collaboratively with illustrators, artists such as Chu Hui.
Yeah.
How did besides the fact that you and Honlai-Chu were friends, colleagues, writing within the same generation, how did that particular project evolve?
I think some writers are very pure. They don't like to, people give them exercise to do or give them a topic to write off. They just want to write their own thing. But for me, writing in some way is a game. So it's fun to play with someone else. So, for the book Dictionary of Two Cities, in fact, I come up with the idea and talk to Coco and say that, hey, why don't we do something? And she also thinks this is something fun to do. And as we write the stories, it's during the time, Hong Kong is also under transformation. There are many things that is like you don't want to look at on the newspaper. But you feel that you have some kind of power when you write through fiction. So I think it's one of the way how we face the change of the society, and we play a game together to resist the reality we see.
So you, Honlai-Chu, Dong Kai-chung, all authors, same basic generation, all will be in this series.
Mm-hmm.
How do you, if you were forced to, and I'm going to force you to, say, define yourself, this group of writers, either in relation to or in resistance to older generation of Hong Kong writers, and also sort of the larger Sinophone world, people you know from Taiwan, mainland, diaspora?
Yeah.
Sorry, big question.
No, I think this is a very important question. I'm not going to reject it. What I'm thinking is that when you talk about the generations of Hong Kong writers, I just think Hong Kong has such a short history of literature. It's only start, you can trace from the 20s, the earliest. So I don't think of Hong Kong has a long history of writing. And I don't even think of the changes so huge. For me, Hong Kong is always somewhere not at the center. So in your introduction, you use words as experimental. That's how I feel about Hong Kong writings. I think Hong Kong writings is often and always experimental because Hong Kong is not the cultural center. People often think it's a cultural desert. So people are free to do whatever they think. And fiction is never going to sell. It sells in the US maybe. So people just don't care about it. Don't care about what the readers is going to think about it. So they just do whatever they like. I think this is the tradition.
So you think you have some freedom, more freedom, because it doesn't matter?
I would say that people choose to be a writer. They're already choosing to do something that outside of the center of the culture. So it's not that they don't care, it's that they try to find another way to live or try another way to tell their stories.
So when did you decide to start living another way and to write the stories?
I don't know. Let me answer your question, the second part first. It's difficult. You asked about how is Hong Kong different from other countries, especially like mainland and Taiwan. I would say that it's very, very different. I remember I was in a conference and there is a postgraduate student from Taiwan, and he go to Hong Kong and complain that they don't have city literature really about city. I think in some way it's true because mainland China and Taiwan has a long tradition of finding their own national identity. They're very linked to their land, motherland, and about history. So they pay less attention to the space and the transformation. They always want to tell a story that is we would say like a historical story. But in Hong Kong, we don't have this tradition. And we don't have something called, I don't know how you translate into English, like motherland literature, 鄉土文學. So it's a big trend in mainland China and Taiwan, but we don't have that tradition in Hong Kong at all.
Does it matter to you, do you care if your work ends up in English or in other languages? Does it matter ultimately to you?
I mean, as a reader, I would think that it's very important to see writings from different countries. And as an author, I think author is someone like a reader too, because you respond to what you read. So I think not just my book or books in Hong Kong, I think translation is a very important word, important work throughout the world. When we talk about world literature, when we talk about understanding each other, I think translation is the first step we have to do. It's important.
Did you talk a little bit, if you would, about when you were at the International Writing Program in Iowa, and if you noted any differences in your writing process or within sort of interaction with authors from all of these various countries and languages?
Yeah, I do feel some differences. As I say, I feel the Hong Kong writers is experimental. I can see that in a way how we write fictions. As I see in the U.S., they have workshops, teaches people to become a writer. So I see that in those workshops, it's often when they teach people how to write fiction, they teach it in a way that is quite traditional. I mean, it's not bad or good, but it's to my surprise that I never taught creative writing like that. Like they will have plot, characters, how you develop characters. That's something for me like very technical. Of course, it's very useful, very important. But in Hong Kong, I would see that when people think about creative writing, often they would think more about how to break through the forms. So to me, it's one of the big differences I see there when I talk to other writers and also people who study in the workshops there. Yeah.
Ms. Shusi.
First of all, that was a wonderful reading. I would like to ask you to place your work in the larger world literary context, not just in the science sphere, because what I see in your work, and I'd love to hear your comments on this, is a very dystopic vision, which I think is what you see in a lot of fiction worldwide now, in many countries, in many languages, and also the form you have taken, the sort of breaking of traditional form, is something I see too as very much a trend in a lot of fiction worldwide now, whether in English or in American, Europe, everywhere. So I'd be curious to see how you place yourself in that.
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I have been thinking about I don't know how you categorize this kind of writing. Many people would immediately think of the tradition from Kafka or surreal. For me, when I start writing, I do think of form as the most important thing. Like I would like to do different kinds of experiment. But also one thing I think is very important for me is the forms may seem similar in many different works, but I think the form has something to do with the reality. I think the forms I use, like I say, the Dictionary of Two Cities, is basically based on something I see in Hong Kong. So I think if you look closely to different writings, I think we can, of course, use some theoretical terms to name them easily. But what I'm interested more now is that how to use the form of the experiment I know to tell the reality I see. And I think that's the most important thing. And there is one thing, sometimes I think that for Chinese writers, no matter it's in Hong Kong or mainland, we face a problem that when the West sees us, the first thing is that our identity is Asian writer, Chinese writer, or Hong Kong writer. We have to tell a story of our own place. But I think form and the content are together. Sometimes I think writers outside Asia want something very direct, like a real story, a realistic story. But I think if you really want to understand another culture, you can't just read the stories. You have to read the stories through their form. So that's what I want to do, like to tell the story in a form that is related to the content.